So when we look at this tool-like thing, and if we go with what I was saying last time, which that it can't be a fake thing, simple as it is, they've got to have a little wooden horse at the end of the, at the end of it. And well, hold on, but my point is that not there's several things about this. One is that you can't give them a wooden horse inside a block of wood and tell them to chip away the softwood until they get a wooden horse, right? We can't do that. Second, we also cannot, sit there and guide their wrist and say, see, right? And we can't do that. So we have to accept something as teachers. We have to accept that there's going to be a different trajectory for different people, that there's going to be a different that this whatever we provide may not work this time for that person. So if we continue to torture ourselves with what if someone doesn't, what if someone doesn't, what if someone doesn't, we will never have a working device or a working procedure. We need something that, yes, is utilitarian in the sense that it can work and is better than other devices or certainly better than not having one. So, okay, with that, we know that we cannot guarantee that it's going to produce a story. You cannot have a story making device that will guarantee a story. Impossible. You have just shot yourself in the temple when you do that. So, but the process of getting there, even if it doesn't work very well, should be itself enough for the person to say, aha, that didn't work so great, but you know what? I bet we could. I bet it will if we do it again, or I think I've got a hang of it now, or I'm willing to try again. You are definitely on track with the whole point of focusing on psychic content, of this purpose of this scenario. And one thing that I think plays a big role in this is when is, or how am I going to put it? Is it going to be genuine? I mean, it's not psychic content until it's actually, content or contact, right? It's psychic contact with the person. So therefore, it can't be something fictional like the character's deepest secret, right? It can't. I mean, it. Does that make sense? I mean, it's got to be contact with the person. What degree of psychic content are we talking about? I agree with you that doing something like you find in my game Spiona is probably not going to do this. Or what I did actually a bit before that with a scenario that I played a lot with Sorcerer, that I used in my Sex and Sorcery book. And I'll briefly bore you with it to show you that I understand that I'm not recommending this degree, right? In it, there is a sorcerer guy, a professor in his 40s. There is his graduate student that he is getting romantic with or is romantic with, um, who is not a sorcerer, and then we've got the wife who has appeared after 10 years absence, and that was a botched sorceress ritual, right, 10 years ago. Um, the wife is pregnant with a demon baby. She is a sorceress. She's a little addled, but she is a sorceress with this demon baby in her for 10 years. And then there's the demon, who is a passing woman demon, who is bound to the sorcerer, and she is pregnant with the actual baby of the sorcerer and the wife, who is a sorcerer, and that's his demon. Right, that was wrong. That's the sorcerer who owns or binds that demon. So that was wrong. The graduate student's an NPC. We've got the demon baby. Sorry, we've got the sorcerer baby inside the belly of the demon, the wife who's pregnant with a demon, and the professor who's the father. So we have a real family. We've got the two sorcerers who are who are parents of the child. Yeah, the embryo. Yes. Uh-huh. And so, but the point is that this is the night when the demon woman, pregnant with the son, and the wife, pregnant with the demon baby, they arrive on this. They finally find the professor on the same night while he's hanging out with his graduate student. What I'm trying to say is that I didn't give any motivations. I gave some the for sorcerer you get some inkling of their outlooks in this scenario, yes, but you don't tell the players how to play their characters. There are no stated goals, for example. And so, therefore, it was an incredible Rorschach test. I played this multiple times through the course of 5 or 4 days, and the different approaches that people jumped into playing this instantly, right? Massive connection right away, but their varying interpretations of who was like a good person and who wasn't was enormous. And of course, they all insisted afterwards that they were only playing the character as given. What I found was that it worked out beautifully, although a little disturbingly. Some people were, I learned to stop saying, oh, but that was your interpretation because it got people upset. Um, but they didn't, it was too intuitive for them to want to acknowledge as a creative act on their part. Now notice that that one is particularly aggressive, right? I tapped into, deep biology for this and socio-biocultural, whatever you want to call it, all that stuff. Here, I suggest you do the same in a, for lack of a better word, somewhat less gut spilling, content. But the trouble is, of course, is that genre content here is your enemy. Idiom is your friend, genre is your enemy. Okay, and that I think is going to be the only touchstones I can give you. Let's do the psychic contact thing. Say that I call this in utero, right? Say that in utero is perhaps the far end of what we're talking about, and perhaps not really a teaching scenario, right? But it's there's a spectrum on which you're going to want to find, where you want to be on that spectrum for this within utero, kind of, at toward the far end of it. If we stick with idiom, we can pick anything we like as long as it is freed up to become whatever it will in play, right? And so you're not trapped into the endings of the genre conventions and stuff like that. If we get to this point where you're looking at a, for lack of a better word, digestible scenario with a fairly solid but not too traumatic psychic content thing, and that's actually not that hard because most stories, I think stories are based on human concerns. Here's some characters, here's some stuff, maybe there's a couple of choices about it, pick this or that about the character or something like that. And you have this, it's got some kind of root human concern in the very warp and woof of the situation. And the important thing I think that we can take from In Utero is not to tell the players what they're supposed to make of this, where they're supposed to get their character to go. And so therefore they can't look at the sheet and say, okay, my job is to get us through the tunnel, or my job is to become, rich and famous or whatever. You're looking at this guy and we'll just find out whether you want him to become more rich and famous or not. The nice thing is that I think, as I have found, and unless you run into specific blocks that I do not think are soluble, unless you run into specific blocks that I do not think are soluble, I think the players are actually going to be better at this than you are as the GM, and will do fine. In other words, they're good at being the lab rats. They'll be excellent lab rats. And the people who cannot will bounce off it immediately and go away, which is good. And so with that in mind, yes, this is training for the GM, but let us bear in mind that we are right now in this conversation, we are trusting the humans playing characters to be pretty good humans, right? And I'm okay with trusting that. I trust that the intuitive crunch, the response to In Utero in play and in many many other games I've played of such things, not necessarily that aggressive, the seizing upon the human concern in there and acting upon it is quite reliable. You just have to not fuck around. With this stated, I think that you've got the principles in mind to start putting something together that you find fun to do, and you can take it into activity and actually do it with people and take it from there, right? So that's one thing. I desperately do not recommend doing it all in your own head, putting it on paper, and then dusting your hands and saying, "There, that's the learning scenario." I mean, that's yeah. If this didn't change from your first version drastically through the first few times you do it, then I would be suspicious. I mean, just like any class, like every time I designed and taught a class, the first term I taught it, I reserved major revision, for afterward, and sometimes halfway through. So, because it's just have to, right? Let's stop here because for that topic, because I think that this is where I say, you go, um, hooray! All I do now from cheerlead is cheerlead, right? But now I want to do the other things that I talked about finishing up with, and without being a contentious pain in your ass any more than I am by default. Um, the issue here is precisely those things which you say now and have said several times you're good with. Um, for the purposes that you've made very, very clear over and over again, I'm not. There are system elements that need review and reconsideration, and if they remain exactly the way that they are, it's because you want them that way. And that's what I want to kind of hit at right now. Yeah. Now I did go over the file you sent, and I agree that there are uh, much deeper considerations, right, in the core manuscript that you sent me rather than the micro. I mean, I get that, and so I agree with you about that. Um, one is the claim of generic. If you want this to be generic, then, as with the Curse of Steve Jackson games designs, then baking in non generic phenomena into your so called generic point constructions is, how am I going to put it? It is undercutting, right, your goals. Either you're lying about being generic. Now I'm not talking to you really, but either that trajectory of game design is lying about being generic, or they're uh, bad at it. So a very good example is to take a look at the management of wealth and debt. First of all, the simplest thing is let's stick with exactly your construction and not challenge any of its fundamentals, which is that character points are going to translate into wealth levels, and second, that those wealth levels, as you have just implied a bit, and as implied in a point structure, are associated with different degrees of impact on the game world. That a wealthy person is going to impact things. It's basically a superpower. You're buying powers, right? Greater powers as you get greater and greater wealth. And I'm not going to challenge that for purposes of the next 60 seconds. Then what I'm saying is that there have to be units of acquisition that the point structure addresses. Just like there are time units of debt that the point structure addresses, not in what those time units are, but that there is one. That's what I mean. Okay? Your discussion of debt is riddled with the word month. Okay, so that is the question. You just created setting in a massively important way toward one of the most important human variables, social variables that we know, which is debt. So the idea being that there are in fiction time units embedded in the rules like that, in the allegedly generic rules, is what I am critiquing. And so the idea that these need to be units, yes, units of play in a major way, but we have no idea whether it's a century, a month, or a minute based on the nature of the idiom that we're doing. Then there comes the other question, which is more challenging and definitely does not need to be addressed in back and forth conversation. This is something that I'm laying out there. And I personally do not think that either of these alternatives is bad. It's just a question of which you want it to be and why. The one is the one you have, what we just said, right? That character points go into creating levels of these things, and these things are uh, equated as being in game mechanical superpower stuff. Now, if we, yeah, the other one is actually what early champions did, of all things, which most people have completely forgotten after Champions was GURP sized, um, which is that Peter Parker being a photographer and being of a particular social class is not represented in skills or points. Doctor Doom ruling Latveria is not represented in skills or points. The book is extraordinarily clear. It says, just say it. You want your character to be a millionaire? He's a millionaire. This was in 1981, so the word millionaire meant something. And so the idea being that this was considered ordinary. You were freed up. But my guy can like go in a jet and get across the country anytime he wants. My guy can't. Yeah, and you're the one who wants to play that guy. Are you complaining because you get to play the guy that you wanted? And so then the idea then came in that in the character's own sphere of activity, they had just as much clout in that sphere of activity as any other character in their sphere of activity. So I am not saying that either of those is better or that one solves problems that the other one has. The question is, if you're committed to a particular one, we now have to look at its virtues and the role that it's going to play in the rest of your system. So, but this is just my door. Having compared those things and looking at your commitment to that particular kind of thing, which I agree is fully there and I'm not challenging it, and looking at some of the points that we just did. Now let's go to step 2, which is the experience point system, which, as you know, is not decoupled, is intimately tied to precisely the things we were just talking about, as well as to increasing your attributes and skills. So, with this in mind, I know, or I don't know if you're familiar with my construction of what I call currency, which is the interplay among effectiveness, resources, and positioning. Positioning is those things you just said, rank, status, wealth, things like that, and related matters. So kinship is another good example that fits right in there. So with those, uh, you with those, and looking at XP, and I'm looking at the core thing you just sent me, right? All the ways you get it and all the ways you use it. I would like to venture the idea that by putting in more currency into the situation, the point is not merely the bloat in the amount, which, as we have seen in many games, merely produces inflation and is of no real interest. Right? What? Because then the foes just rack up to meet you, and it's just the same damn game all over again. But in here we're talking about the opportunity to reconfigure those portions of the characters relative to one another. That's what the new points are good for. The new points are good for reconfiguring the relationship of your character's effectiveness, positioning, and resources. Why then must we have means of gaining XP which amount to singing for your supper? Why all the little fiddly bits about you get it when this happens and you get it when that happens, you get it when you do this, you get it when you do that? Let us contrast this with the extreme opposite, just for purposes of framing my question for you, which I'm asking you to consider and possibly reject. There is no need to debate over it and arrive at a conclusion. They're in a game of this kind. Not necessarily, I would not say this for classic RuneQuest, for example, in which you get better at skills that you use. But in a game of this kind, it is it serves it is arguably more in service to what you're talking about, what you said a couple of minutes ago about hooking the characters in, tying them in more strongly, letting them decorate their place and stuff, simply to say it's not a matter of the GM judging or paying attention. In fact, the GM doesn't have to pay attention at all. You just get this many points at the end of a session of play. Everyone shut up. You just do. It's not the GM's job. You get this after a session of play. You just do. There is no singing for your supper. There is no good role playing. There is no relationship to what happened in play, except insofar as how you're going to spend them. You tell me how. You think, right? And it's perfectly functional. And in fact, in most games which are based on the hero system historically, including GURPS especially, where you get a handful of usable points, and although any given session doesn't give you an immense amount, they do rack up pretty quick, and within a few sessions you suddenly discover your character has changed immensely. In a good way, usually. Like your character is reshaped, their positioning, just like you're talking about, right? And so what I'm saying is for core, I'm not talking generically for role-playing design, but for core, that serves the purposes you're talking about very well. And it's not even a matter of the convenience of the GM not having to pay attention so much. That's how am I going to put it? If it served the game well, then I would say keep that subroutine in there and pay attention. But I'm saying about whether it serves the game at all. That's what I'm talking about. And I leave that for you with no need for me continuing to advocate or you pushing back on it or any kind of, I'm not on the design committee, right? You don't need my vote. Now, that then leads to point number 3, which is that we are talking about character changes. And of course, one perfectly wonderful kind of character change is your character's demise or similarly permanent fate. And here is where things get quite interesting, especially with a lot of games that I've been playing lately. I think we can easily toss out the idea of let's avoid the phobia about it in 2 ways. One way to avoid the phobia about it is to say that doesn't happen in this game that we're playing right now. I mean, that would be, for example, a design dial or a design toggle in cores to say whether you're going to be able to, fucking die or be taken out of play through some permanent fate or not. And that can be a toggle, right? If we run with this a bit and recognize that we could simply do exactly as you say and say, I'm going to play some core, I'm going to play with some people, and somebody says, well, core is very, generic or customizable. What are you going to do? Give us a thing. And one of the things that I would include, as you say, in that very first kind of chunk of basics that's provided is to say, and don't worry about the dying or being brain blasted into infinity. That's not really what we're talking about. This is more like My Little Pony, right? The or Gilligan's Island, or pick a more serious example. Star Trek. We know Spock's not going to die. In the course of the series, right? So that's not really in the cards. We're playing about something else. Okay, or you could, in the very same circumstance, say, you know what? Anyone can die. And character death is an event and a character development just like any other. It is, if you will, a different form of XP. Okay, and so you just say so, right? I mean, and if your game is to be generic, I mean, I do think that some toggle or spectrum among those things would have to be included. Otherwise, the game is not fucking generic. I'm playing Bushido right now too, of course. So the interesting thing about Bushido is that when your character dies, there is a slightly fiddly mechanic from the on that they have gained in life into the mechanics of making your new character. Some of it is provisional. For example, some of it only applies if you take on the same profession as the old character. But the actual fictional connection is left customizable. In other words, whether this actually is some kind of reincarnation or not, or is just left up to you, right? And so that set the pace for a number. Now, Pendragon, on the other hand, if it is much more direct, it's got the right. Well, you can either pass on this benefit of your character's whatnot to your offspring, your heir, um, in which case a lot of wealth comes with it, or it can be a little bit more spiritual, like going to your squire, but it is rooted in the fiction. It is a character who is related to the career of that character, but there is a transfer of these mechanical phenomena. So you're not like making the character like as if they were a beginning character. So there's different ways to do this, right? Right, right. All of these are some pretty cool things. And then there's a few other things which I talked about with somebody that I consulted with a couple of years ago who had a very specific structure in which it made sense, and he wanted characters to be dying off and being replaced, and was really struggling with this, right? Especially because there were power levels and stuff. And what he hit upon while talking is, wait a minute, replacement characters have a different sphere of effectiveness that the original characters don't. And so you end up with different kinds of characters if they are replacement characters in a specific sphere of game effectiveness. I'm not sure if I'm saying that quite right. It wasn't a sphere of in fiction effectiveness necessarily, like replacement characters are magic and beginning characters are not. It was a little better than that. It was much more about simply the way they attack the mechanics, right? Is different. So so there are different ways. No, I know. I'm speaking quickly, and we don't, and I don't remember all the details of that particular consult. But the point was that he found out a way that worked for him for replacement characters to have identities as replacement characters, so that it was, in many ways, it changed play. It wasn't just a replacement. It was a change to how the game was played when you had a replacement character. And so that made a lot of sense for him in that game. Um, so what I'm trying to say is there's lots of different ways to look at this, um, and that in your setup, how does XP relate to that is clearly a very meaningful currency, a very meaningful thing. So, for example, right? Do you or don't you? And this is the critical one for me because I can actually make a case against unspent XP can be transferred in some useful way because that why would you force people to bank for that, right? If their character is meets their permanent end of some kind and there is some mechanism, as you say, the kind that you kind of like, that mechanics of that character, points of that character somehow get recast in this one, um, why should I have to bank for it? What you're bringing to a next character, if this is what we're doing. I mean, we could be playing where there isn't a character death or permanent fate. I get that. But if we are, and if you want there to be this carryover of some kind, then we're saying the same thing. That it should not be based on something that is spent for other reasons in the original character. It should be some other kind of translation from character to character that isn't just looking at how much XP they're currently having. we are not necessarily talking about the in fiction of it all. Bushido actually had an important insight, right? That you can benefit from the so called reincarnation rules without really worrying about reincarnation, right? As such in the fiction. And so therefore, if you wanted to accentuate this fictionally, you could, but you might not have to. That we are talking about a player to character and player to player relationship when we talk about these things, not really about whether there is or isn't reincarnation in the setting. And so that's stated. I think I've kind of laid the groundwork here. On the one hand, we do have the spectrum from never mind death and permanent, disabling absence from play, right? Let's never mind that, all the way to can happen to anyone anytime, fear your dice, at the other end. And then you have all sorts of things in between. And then if you do have some sort of I get to keep playing even though this character has come to a certain fate. I get to keep playing. This doesn't eject me from play. I don't have to sit there in the corner with a bag over my head with dead character written on it, right? Um, in that case, then you say, all right, what does it mean to keep playing? And we don't want desperation devices here, do we? No, we want system. So that's where I'm going to leave it. And where and how XP are involved, if at all, is a very good question. And you can see that there are many answers to that, ranging all the way from no XP or out of the picture, don't worry about it, all the way to they translate in a weird way or whatever you want, whatever you think works. So, and I also want to point out, I'm not advocating for an XP based transfer from character to character. I'm bringing it up simply because that is part of what we see in many existing systems. And if you're going to reject that, know that you're rejecting it and move on for a better, more appropriate solution for you. You can arrive at decisions for how you want to do that or how you say how this is done, at least as sort of the default for core, because no matter what it is you do, numbers or no numbers, it is a procedure. It is a procedure. You just described it. You carry out a procedure by which this happens, and that procedure has qualities. Whether it has numbers or not is of no interest to me, in principle. It is of interest to me downstream from talking it here, but at this level of discussion, it's not right or wrong to do it with numbers or without numbers. You choose the way it works for you for this game, and that's good. You were extraordinarily clear about this in a fashion that I found inspiring and fun in our last session when you talked about how the Harmon circle that the GM or whoever may perceive themselves to be on, perhaps even without the vocabulary to say that, suddenly like turns into a different circle that's rolling that way instead. We're done. That's me cheerleading. You can see me on the sidelines now, just like waving a little, a little hat, the flag with a smiley face, and I got nothing else to say. So, you've accounted for this very nicely to the point where I feel no need to keep stinging, right? Based on everything you've said, I think you fully recognize that as soon as it hits a page and is read, you will be getting people who will see it as your scripts to follow. And furthermore, I will point to my game Trollbabe, which operates off of what you were just describing, and I even use the same word, pivot point. And the point is that you don't see them coming, you don't know what they are, and they will occur during play, in different ways. And the key for the GM is not to make pivot points. The key is to recognize when you've hit one, and you're going to recognize it just after. You're going to recognize it after you've hit it, and that's what you need to be alert for. And so but to do this, I made a diagram. And the diagram had scenes, and little conflicts, and different numbers of conflicts and side scenes. And some scenes didn't have them and stuff like that. And I swear a friend took that book and flipped, not really reading it, flipped and flipped, read a paragraph here and there, skimming, hit that diagram and says, oh, yeah, okay, so this is the structure for a scenario. You're setting up how to structure the scenario. And I was like, fuck. Just like the minute he saw like a string of scenes depicted visually, bam, his head was done. And I swear, there's no way once a person does that to actually say, did you read that section? Can you read those words? No, they're not in a reading state. They're not in a receptive state. They've, that's what they saw. And the tendency to do that in role playing texts as a reader is so fucking strong. And it has a lot to do with the destruction of the word story, which, we can historically pinpoint exactly how that happened. So my point is that's just one more thing. I'm not recommending including the Harmon Circle talk. I found the part where you say play spawns new ones of unknown, unpredictable sizes and unpredictable. I know the word rolling is not technically part of the Harmon Circle, but I like it. And the idea that the circle can be a wheel that can roll, God knows where. And I actually found that rather inspiring to envision something like that. Or the old wheel basically just disintegrates and the baby wheel is going off in that direction. Now you see, this I think is powerful, and because you're not stating it as the masterful GM throwing in a twist, you're talking more about just paying attention to what the hell is happening and honoring it. Phrased that way, that's got punch. Okay, so in that case, that kind of concludes where what I feel I have to give, to the point where you are loaded for bear, for many things to play with, to consider, to address, to try. And I really think that you're obviously more than capable of managing that. Most people are actually more so than they think, and you are very well situated to go and put these things into writing, into the table, and see how it looks and judge what you think needs to go into the book. I mean, that's you're there. It's time to do that.